Hi, I'm Howard Wetzman, Chief Medical Officer of Townsend. People often ask me, do I still need recovery now that I'm on the right medication for addiction? My answer is yes. Here's why. It would be great if addiction was curable. It would even be great if addiction could be reversed and we could just go back to being normal. It would be great if our brains could just forget all the counterproductive things they learned in active addiction. But whether we were born with addiction or got it later, there's no way to cure it. It's chronic. There's no way to just reset the clock and start over. There's no way to forget the associations learned in active addiction. That doesn't mean we're stuck with misery or that we'll die of addiction. It does tell us that what we need to do is have a way of living with addiction. One thing we'll need to do is maintain good dopamine tone, and there are some things we can do there. We can abstain from things that give us dopamine spikes. We can adhere to our proper medication regimen. We can have a good diet and regular exercise. And finally, and perhaps most importantly, we can stay in active recovery with others. We'll go through these factors one by one to better understand them. We need to abstain from dopamine spikes. A dopamine spike is the same as the dopamine response to a drug. Dopamine rises quickly to higher levels than normal, and while it's accompanied by a brief feeling of comfort, it causes an immediate decrease in the number of dopamine receptors. Because of this, the spike is followed by a crash. Crashes can, and often will, result in compulsive use. While we don't want dopamine spikes, we do want good dopamine tone. But dopamine tone can be hard to understand, so let's spend a little time on it. Normally, dopamine is released into the space between two brain cells. It acts on the dopamine receptors of the receiving cell, and then is sucked back up by the sending cell. This dopamine is being released every so often, and is being taken back up at a constant rate. Because its release and reuptake are balanced, there's a certain amount of dopamine between the cells to act on the receptors. The action of that amount of dopamine on those receptors is what creates the dopamine tone. So if the vacuum cleaner that's sucking the dopamine back up starts to run faster, the dopamine between the cells is less because it isn't being released any faster. And if the vacuum cleaner slows down, things go back to the way they started. There can also be a change in the packets of dopamine that are released. Maybe the packets are released more slowly than normal. Maybe the packets are released as fast but don't have as many dopamine molecules in them. The vacuum cleaner doesn't go slower to compensate, so there's less dopamine available to the receptors and less dopamine tone. So far, we've only talked about dopamine's effect on dopamine tone, but the receptors count too. What if all of a sudden the number of dopamine receptors was lowered? Remember, the dopamine tone isn't the amount of dopamine, but the action on the receptors. So if the receptors go away, so does dopamine tone. So for those of you who like math, you can think of an equation where dopamine tone is equal to the number of dopamine molecules times the number of dopamine receptors times the time that dopamine has at the receptors. So if we make less dopamine or release less dopamine, our dopamine tone is lower. If we have less dopamine receptors, our dopamine tone is lower. If we take up the dopamine too fast and it doesn't have enough time at the receptor, our dopamine tone is lower. Now you need one more fact to put all this together. There are two common stressors that lower your dopamine receptor density. These receptors literally go back inside the cell and aren't available to see the dopamine. These two stressors are being alone and feeling less than others. What recovery does is maintain the number and density of your dopamine receptors. Working the steps with a sponsor, being part of a fellowship, giving service to others, all contribute to not being alone and not feeling less than. This process requires continual renewal because the illness is always there, telling us we don't need anyone because it has our backs. Once we have good dopamine tone, we see the world differently. Things don't bother us as much, and we don't feel less than as often as we did. Dopamine tone increases still further, and as it does, we handle things better, increasing our sense of our worth and increasing dopamine tone even further. It's an upward spiral. The brain with the illness of addiction will continually try to take over and convince us it has the answers. The answers will have to come from somewhere else. But we don't want to trust another person's ill brain either, so taking advice is not the way. Recovery is based on principles aligned with how nature and the world work, not on anyone's personal opinion. Recovery is living by a set of principles that work even for people who are ill. These principles are embodied in the 12-step programs, but there are other methods of recovery as well. Here's what they all have in common. There will be other people. No one recovers alone. The relationships will be horizontal. No one is the boss of anyone else. There will be a loving mentor who isn't a boss and isn't telling you his opinion, but rather what worked for him. There will be a cleansing of the conscience and amends for harms done, and there will be service to others. If you have those things in your recovery program, I don't care what you call it. It will maintain your dopamine receptor level and help maintain your dopamine tone. That's why we need recovery, even if we have good medication and we finish treatment.